I'm Brian Harward. I'm Professor of Political Science and Department of Political Science and Director of the Center for Political Participation. And we're very pleased this evening to see such a turnout. And we're also pleased, of course, to meet our speaker who's come to us from Northeastern University of Boston, Massachusetts for the 2 days. He's had quite a busy time of it already and will continue through tomorrow. And I will remind you at the conclusion of tonight's event, but I do want to note now, if in case I forget, that tomorrow at 12:15 we will reconvene in this room for a second talk from Chuck Fountain on the 1919 Black Sox scandal. So each of you is invited to return. At that event, we will feed you. So please do come early if you'd like. I'm sure the food will be ready to go by 12. Before we get started tonight, I will not be introducing our guest. I will introduce one of our best students who will then introduce our guest. But I want to take a special moment now to not only to thank our guest speaker, but to also thank two individuals without whom this event would not be happening. And one is Sarah Holt, who has been behind everything we've done this semester and well before that. But it's been just a series of events this semester that have a really high quality thanks to her efforts. So thank you, Sarah, for doing this for us. And also Greg Peterson, who, as a long friend of the college, has been instrumental in so many of the events that we've been putting on, and it was in no small part due to him that Chuck Fountain has agreed to come tonight. I'm not sure that he would have agreed to come to Meadville in November were it not for the influence that Greg would have on him. So thank you, Greg, and thank you, Cindy, for being here tonight and making this possible for us. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Hannah Schaefer. Hannah is a senior at Allegheny, a CPP fellow, a news editor for the campus newspaper, and is a community and justice studies major with a double minor in political science and journalism in the public interest. Oh my goodness, yes, I knew that. But I'm very pleased to have her here to introduce our speaker, Chuck Fountain. Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. This evening, we are lucky enough to have with us Charles Fountain from the Northeastern School of Journalism. After graduating from Boston College, Fountain attended the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism before beginning his successful career in the field. Fountain has written for and appeared on many outlets, including the Boston Globe, USA Today, ESPN, NPR, and many others. In addition to his work as a reporter and sports anchor for WSMW-TV in Massachusetts and a sports reporter for ABS Radio in New York, Fountain has also authored 4 books: Another Man's Poison, The Life and Writing of Columnist George Fraser, Sports Writer, The Life and Times of Grantland Rice, Under the March Sun, The Culture and Commerce of Spring Training, and The Betrayal, the 1919 World Series and the Birth of Modern Baseball, which was named one of the best books of 2015 by the Boston Globe. While we will have the opportunity to hear Fountain talk about the 1919 World Series scandal tomorrow, tonight we have the pleasure of hearing Fountain's presentation on one of Allegheny's great, journalist Ida Tarbell. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Charles Fountain.
I'm told, okay, the mic is working. I'm told that there was a delay in between the time I pushed the button and the time that it would be working. But thank you so very much for coming tonight, all of you. I want to particularly thank the students for coming. I realize that on a college campus, even on a Monday night, there's a lot more going on than hearing some old guy talk about somebody who's even older. But thank you so much for coming. I want to thank the faculty members who encouraged their students to come, and I particularly want to thank the faculty members who required their students to come. So that's always been the secret of my getting crowds on college campuses. You're probably wondering, after hearing that introduction and hearing a litany of sports guys here, what is this guy doing, presuming to come from Boston into our community to talk of one of our own? And believe me, I'm a little nervous about all of this. That I had long thought that, I knew all I needed to know about Ida Tarbell. One of the blessings of getting older is continuing to learn and continuing to discover new things. One of the curses of getting older is that one of the things that you most frequently discover is how little it is you know, and how the vast that field that you still need to learn is. And like I said, that I felt that, I knew enough about Ida Tarbell that I taught a class in journalism history, and the muckrakers and Ida Tarbell were a big part of that. So that there's only so much time, there's so much else I have to learn. And then 4 years ago, my wife took a job in western Pennsylvania, and we bought a home on Chautauqua Lake. And I came out to the Chautauqua Institution, and a whole new world opened up for me. And as part of this world was the discovery that Ida Tarbell, this muckraker that I knew well, I thought, was a part of Chautauqua's history as well. So I said, I really need to know more about Ida Tarbell. And 2 summers ago, I came out here in advance of proposing a course at Chautauqua on Ida Tarbell at Chautauqua and beyond. In preparation for that course, for proposing that course, I came out here and met Jane Westenveld in the library and spent a couple of days going through the Ida Tarbell papers here, and made it about 1/4% through the papers. It is a vast and rich collection, and I would really encourage the students here particularly to make use of it. And as I learned ever more about Ida Tarbell, I made a connection that I should have made long before, because 2 of my colleagues at Northeastern University are Walter Robinson and Matt Carroll. And if you've seen the film Spotlight, you know Walter Robinson and Matt Carroll. You better recognize them better as Michael Keaton. He played Walter Robinson. And Brian Darcy James played Matt Carroll. They were 2 of the 4 people that were featured in the film, 2 of the half-dozen people that broke that marvelous story. It wasn't a marvelous story, it was a marvelous piece of journalism on a horrible story about the clergy sex abuse scandal in the Roman Catholic Church. And for the first time, I began thinking about the direct line that runs from Robbie and Matt back through Woodward and Bernstein, back through the independent investigative journalists of the 50s and the 40s, I.F. Stone, George Seldes, and then tracing that lineage back to the muckrakers of McClures magazine at the turn of the century. Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, Samuel McClure, Ray Stannard Baker, Finley Peter Dunn, William Allen White, the entire litany of what was probably the most remarkable American magazine ever for the impact that it had. So I embarked on a new adventure of learning a little bit more about Ida Tarbell, which brings me here tonight. And I'm hopeful that I've got a perspective to add. It's a little presumptuous to think that I would add any understanding or information to your understanding of Ida Tarbell, but I might hope that I would add a perspective to your understanding of Ida Tarbell. We are forever affected by our childhood. However far we may be from it, and some of us are further from it than others in this room, but our childhood is what shaped us and what forever shapes us. This is Ida Tarbell's childhood. in the background. This was her home. I don't know whether these pictures are from Rouseville or Titusville, were the two communities where she lived, or whether it was from Pitt Hole or one of the other oil boom towns in the Pennsylvania oil region. But this was Ida Tarbell's childhood. She was born on a farm in Erie County. Her birthday is tomorrow, by the way. If you're looking for something to celebrate, you can start after we leave here tonight and continue right through the day tomorrow. It will be the 162nd anniversary of her birth. She was born on November 5th, 1857. She was destined to grow up in Iowa, that her father was out here at the time she was born preparing a homestead for the family. But a series of reversals in the economy and in the family's fortune brought Franklin Tarbell back to Erie County. He walked back, stopping to work along the way. It took him 18 months. He arrived in 1859 when Ida was about a year and a half old, and when a guy named Edwin Drake had just discovered oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. That was the beginning of the American oil industry, and it was the beginning of the Tarbell family's connection with oil. That Franklin Tarbell moved the family to Rouseville and lived there for about 8 or 10 years. And Ida was 3 when they moved there, and I think 13 maybe when they moved to Titusville. And this was what Rouseville was. It was a hillside covered with derricks. And Ida Tarbell described this in her autobiography in words that are much better than I can do it, which is one of the beauties of being able to talk about Ida Tarbell, is you get to lean on Ida Tarbell's prose from time to time. No industry of man in its early days has ever been more destructive of beauty, order, decency than the production of petroleum. All about us rose derricks, squatted engine houses, and tanks. The earth about them was streaked and damp with the dumping of the pumps, which brought up regularly the sand and clay and rocks through which the drill had made its way. If oil was found, if the well flowed, every tree, every shrub, every bit of grass in the vicinity was coated with black grease and left to die. Tar and oil stained everything. If the well was dry, a rickety derrick, piles of debris, oily holes were left, for nobody ever cleaned up in those days. This was where Ida Tarbell grew up. This was the environment Ida Tarbell grew up in. As you might imagine, a scene that looked like this and was described like that did not attract philosophers and poets to the community. That it was a very rough-hewn community, that brothels and saloons proliferated and prospered. There was a joy boat, as it was described, a barge that sailed up Oil Creek to Rouseville, where all of the sins of pleasures of man were available for those who came aboard. But the town of Rouseville fought back against the Joy House. The Joy Boat, the first night it was tied up, and while it was filled with patrons, a number of people in the town of Rouseville decided that they would set it adrift. Such was the party aboard the Joy Boat that no one discovered until the next morning, when they all woke up to find themselves 20 miles downstream. But it sent a very clear message to the people who would capitalize on the sin of the community, that the town of Rouseville was going to fight back. And this had a very deep impression on Ida Tarbell that I think had some repercussions many, many decades later. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But what Ida Tarbell remembered from those days in Rouseville, in amongst the oil derricks and the saloons and the brothels and the rough-hewn men that populated the community, that while it was these men that dug the wells, that drove the economy, it was the women who built the community. The women who insisted that there be a school and there be a teacher for the children in those schools. The women who insisted that a church be built in Rouseville. It was determined that a community church was going to be built, and its denomination would fall to whichever denomination had the most congregants there, which was how it became a Methodist church, and how the previously Presbyterian Tarbells became Methodists. But to Ida Tarbell, that was an awakening and an epiphany. It was the women who made the community. And she never lost sight of that, never lost sight of that fact. And it was something that she felt was essential to the role of women in the community. And again, we'll come back to that several decades down the road, but it was something that left a profound impression on Ida Tarbell as she matured. The Tarbells moved to Titusville, which Ida always considered home, even though she never left there, lived there after college. She was always Ida Tarbell of Titusville. Titusville was a little more, I don't want to say upscale, but it was a little more genteel than Rouseville, which really grew out of the oil industry. Titusville had been a community before the oil boom came around. So while these scenes were common in Titusville, there was far more of a community in Titusville. The other piece of the Tarbell community in those early years of Ida's childhood was the Chautauqua institution. That it was brand new in those days. It started as a Methodist Sunday school camp. And the Tarbells were frequent guests there. That they would take the train from Titusville to Mayville and take a steamship from Mayville down the lake to Fair Point, which was where the institution was and remains to this day. Ida remembered she liked it better when she'd take the steamboat all the way down into Jamestown and they could get off and get ice cream there. There was apparently no ice cream in the early Chautauqua institution. But that community and those foundations of faith and education that Ida Tarbell found at Chautauqua would also shape her life, as much as that epiphany of the women building the community. That she grew up in what she called a yeasty time. Ours was a yeasty time, she said, which meant that the women's movement was just fomenting. And, her mother was an intellectually curious woman who opened up her home to virtual salons of the community people, the community women who would come in and discuss the issues of suffrage. That education was important, reading was important, that the Tarbells subscribed to the weekly New York Tribune. They subscribed to Harper's Monthly and Harper's Weekly. And Ida grew up reading these magazines, and the world came to her through the pages of these newspapers and magazines. It also came to her through the pages of the Police Gazette, which was very unlike the Weekly Tribune. The Police Gazette covered the kinds of stories that were happening in the oil fields of western Pennsylvania in those days. That it was as scandalous as you could get. But that too was a part of Ida's education. She wanted to be a scientist. She saved her money and bought a microscope. She read Charles Darwin and was at odds as a teenage girl with the foundations in her Methodist faith and the religion and the faith that had been the center of her church, suddenly to discover that that was somehow at odds with the science that she was studying and growing enamored of. And how can the science and the evolution and the Darwin that she was reading be consistent with the six-day creation that she had learned from the Bible? All intellectual curiosity, a coming of age of, a brilliant and ultimately seminal American mind. From this yeasty time, she understood that there were two things she wanted. She wanted to be an educated woman, and she wanted to be able to make her way independently. She decided at a young age that she was not going to marry. She was a high school student when she determined that her path was one of work, and that path was inconsistent with married life, and so she would not marry and she would not have a family. She made that decision in high school, and there was nothing that swayed her from that decision. The determination to get an education was going to lead her to Cornell. She was set to go to Cornell, and somewhere before she actually packed her bags and left, she got a visit, the family got a visit from the president of Allegheny College, conveniently located just 30 miles from Titusville rather than across the state 200 miles away like Cornell was, and a Methodist school to boot. So with some urging from her parents, Ida Tarbell came to Allegheny, the only woman in her class. She was not the only woman in her class by the time she graduated. People transferred in, but the only woman when she came. Allegheny was, I would imagine, at once very different from the Allegheny that you know, and very much the same. That I imagine it looked very different. I'm certain it looked very different. There were about 3 buildings when Ida Tarbell was here. But Ida Tarbell came to an Allegheny that was very much like the Allegheny that all of you came to. One that nurtured her and challenged her, that shook her convictions, that opened up that love that she had for learning and intensified it and sent her out into the world with a confidence that she had a mind to compete with whatever challenge life might throw her way. And in that way, I suspect Allegheny has not changed very much over the last 140 years. She had a false start as a school teacher. She hated it. And when wondering what she was going to do, she got another visit from someone at the family home in Titusville. This was a guy named Theodore Flood, who was the publisher of a magazine called the Chautauquan. It was the monthly magazine of the Chautauqua institution, which was mailed to the tens of thousands of people who were enrolled in the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. That the magazine had been responding to all of the questions that came in from all of the people who had enrolled in these distant learning classes that the CLSC put on. They didn't understand some things. Could you explain this? And so rather than responding to all of the questions that came in, they hired Ida Tarbell to anticipate those questions. And it was Ida Tarbell's job, and she held it for 8 years, to write annotations for all of the required readings, all of that month's required readings for the people enrolled in the Literary and Scientific Circle. Ida Tarbell would explain them. She would provide a pronunciation guide. That she lived in terror of getting something wrong. Because when she was doing this in the mid-1880s, there were 180,000 people formally enrolled in the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle classes. And of those 180,000, most had no local libraries. They had no access to the thesaurus, to the encyclopedia, to even a dictionary that would help them understand what those readings that came in the mail were. So that was Ida Tarbell's job, to do that explaining. But there were some of those 180,000 who did have access to libraries and were not going to be shy about calling Ida Tarbell out for any mistakes she made. So she was a fastidious researcher. Shades of what was to come. She was a fastidious researcher, making sure everything she got was correct, that she couldn't be called on that she minimized any mistakes. She was also a feature writer for the magazine. That the circulation of the Chautauquan, which was the monthly magazine, was in excess of 100,000. And in addition to the annotated articles about the readings for that month, it was a general interest magazine, very much the equivalent of Harper's or the Atlantic or Scribner's or Century or any of the other popular 19th century magazines. That it was thus when Ida Tarbell was working for it, and largely because she was working for it. Because she was, for most of her time there, the de facto managing editor. She commissioned the writers. Edward Everett Horton, you may remember a story called The Man Without a Country, prominent 19th century writer. Frances Willard, suffragist. Julia Ward Howe wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but also was an essayist and writer. All wrote for the Chautauquan. Ida Tarbell commissioned the articles, edited the articles, and she wrote a number of articles herself. And through the process came of age of a writer. So much so that by the end of the 1880s, she began to feel a little restless and believe that, I am limited here, that I need to find something else beyond that. It was safe, it was comfortable, and that safety terrified her. Again, I'll rely on her words. I saw with increasing clearness that I could not go beyond a certain point on the Chautauquan, mentally, socially, spiritually. If I remained, it was to accept a variety of limitations, and my whole nature was against the acceptance of limitations. The thing that frightened me earlier in my youth came to the top now, the trap, the thing that made me determine that I would never marry because it meant giving up freedom. It was clear enough that I was trapped, comfortably, most pleasantly, most securely, but trapped. And so she took her leave from the Chautauquan and from the summer work on the Chautauquan, which was writing for the Assembly Herald, the daily newspaper of the summer assembly, a job in which some people in this room have followed in Ida Tarbell's footsteps. A number of Allegheny students over the last years have held a job on the Chautauquan Daily, which is the successor to that Assembly Herald that Ida Tarbell worked on. So it's all connected. You are connected to somebody who graduated in 1886. Please understand that. Tarbell was determined that she would go to Paris. That this, there were a number of French women of the Revolution that she wished to write upon, and this was going to be her, coming of age as a writer. And when she told Theodore Flood that she was leaving the Chautauquan and that she was going to Paris, he said, "Well, how will you make a living?" And she said, "I'm going to write." And Theodore Flood told her, "You can't write, you'll starve." I want to read you something that Theodore Flood wrote, and then read you something that Ida Tarbell wrote at the same time, and you can consider the source of the criticism. This is from an article that Theodore Flood wrote in the Chautauquan, describing the ambience and the atmosphere of the Chautauqua grounds, and those of you who have experienced, may identify with this. Not a few young women and young men who have rowed over the lake and wandered along the shores in the evening shadows of the grand old trees heard here the first flutterings of love's silken wings and are now enjoying married life in a home. Now, I teach writing, and if one of my students wrote that sentence, we'd be having a conversation. That I would applaud their, desire to bring some flair and elan to their writing, and I would tell them, I want to discipline your writing. Love's silken wings is a phrase that you wish to reconsider, please. So this was the man who told Ida Tarbell that she could not write. He told her this just about the same time this article appeared in the Chautauquan. The roofs of Paris are silvered by moonlight. The streets, under the softening influence of night and weariness, are quiet. It is a vastly different Paris from that of today, this Paris of 1763. Tall, stiff houses arise on all sides. The narrow streets are unpaved, unclean, unlighted, deserted, save here and there by noisy revelers, from whom the few belated foot passengers shrink. Cabriolets, driven fast and furious, dash by, splashing mud right and left. Now and then one of these one-horse booby hutches knocks down a man or a child and kills him, but nobody gives the matter much attention. Stop here at the heart of Paris, the point of its busiest life, the Point Neuf, crossing the Seine where it closes after opening its bosom to receive the Ile de la Cité. Just there, where the famous bridge makes an angle where the quay on the right side of the island stands one of the tall houses. An upper window is open, and from the casement leans a young girl. Would you keep reading that article? Don't you want to know who that young girl is and find out a little bit more about her? She couldn't write, though. She put together a syndicate of papers in Paris and cobbled together a living, and came to the attention of a young entrepreneur by the name of Samuel McClure. McClure ran a feature syndicate that sold stories to newspapers, and Ida Tarbell had done some writing for him, but he was thinking about starting a magazine. And he wanted it to be a different magazine that was sort of a counterpoint to the very noisy yellow journalism of the newspapers of the day. And he asked Ida Tarbell if she would write for him. And so in 1894, she came home and took a job as a staff writer and ultimately as an editor at McClures magazine. As I said, very few American magazines have the richness and history and historical impact of McClures. That what its stable of writers wanted to do was to take the kinds of stories that were in the news on a daily basis, labor issues, all sorts of labor stories, strikes, violence, mobilization of more unions in the labor movement, municipal corruption, somebody was always getting indicted and arrested and tried, trusts, the big companies, the growth of American business in spite of the Sherman Antitrust Act of the 1890s, patent medicine ads, claims that we can cure whatever ails you, kinds of stories that were in the news, and to take what we call today a deep dive into these stories, to spend weeks and months examining them, and to bring an understanding that the daily news developments did not bring. And not surprisingly, from a very early moment, they started exploring the idea, and the staff collaborated. The stories were reported and written individually, but the staff collaborated. It was a very close-knit staff, and they collaborated on what the stories would be, what the ideas would be, and who best to write them. And when the idea of trust came along, which trust do we portray? How do we go about it? It did not take long to decide that the trust that they would explore was Standard Oil. And it did also not take very long to decide that the woman who grew up amidst the oil boom of the 1870s would be the person to write that story. Ida Tarbell spent 2 years reporting the Standard Oil story. The story first appeared in November of 1902. It ran in 18 parts through the end of 1904. It is, on the list of most influential 20th century journalism that was compiled by a number of organizations at the turn of the 20th century. Ida Tarbell's story on Standard Oil is 4 or 5. That it rates generally behind Watergate, behind John Hersey's Hiroshima, and behind Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. But it certainly is right up there, and it rates ahead of some of them. I saw it as number 2 behind Watergate on one list of 20th century's most impactful and influential journalism. It led to the dissolution, a Supreme Court decision leading to the dissolution of Standard Oil, but more importantly, it led to our collective understanding of John D. Rockefeller. And I was teaching this class last year. I had a 2-question quiz on the day that I was going to talk about the Standard Oil theories. Question 1, and I'll give it to you right now because it's a short quiz. Question 1 is complete this phrase. And you got to be a fan of old American Standard tunes to do it. But as rich as Rockefeller is the only answer that anybody ever comes up with. That Rockefeller is still the gold standard of wealth in this country. We don't say as rich as Vanderbilt, who was probably, not far behind Rockefeller. We don't say as rich as Mark Zuckerberg. We don't say as rich as Beyonce, which still, today, the gold standard is rich as Rockefeller. All right, question 2 was a multiple choice question. John D. Rockefeller was A, good guy, B, not a good guy. The general consensus to that question is answer B, he's not a good guy. The reason we can still sort of collectively, instinctively say that a century almost after John D. Rockefeller's death, is because of Ida Tarbell's series. That this 18-part series, and there were really two pieces to this Standard Oil series. The first one laid the groundwork for all of the investigative journalism to follow. That the echoes are still being heard today in journalism. That what she did was follow the paper trail. That John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil was probably the most sued company in American business history. So there were any number of court cases that Ida Tarbell went through and looked at the court records, looked at the transcript. What did people allege? What did juries and judges find in their judgments against or for Standard Oil? She coupled this with interviews, but the basis of that series, an 18-part series, was published in 2 volumes of a book, was document-based, not opinion-based, not interpretive, but document-based. The series had a point of view, and the point of view was answer B, John D. Rockefeller is not a good guy. But that point of view was supported and argued with the documents, the letters she was able to get, the interviews she was able to get, finally getting people inside Standard Oil to talk to her in all of that. It was actually it's a piece of journalism that even well over a century later still holds up. It's not perfect, there were errors in it, but it still holds up. The documentation, the basic foundations of how John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil became John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil are still there. The history, there's not a whole lot of history books that hold up for a century or more, but this one does. Has it been supplanted by other studies of Rockefeller and Standard Oil? Yes. But every one of those studies of Standard Oil use this as their foundation. This is their first and primary source. It was a big moneymaker for Samuel McClure and McClure's magazine that, America couldn't get enough of John D. Rockefeller doing bad things to good people. We like to read about, we like to see famous people get their comeuppance. And the American people like to read about John D. Rockefeller. So, McClures was never a big selling magazine, but its circulation was never higher than when the Rockefeller stories were appearing. And Samuel McClure says, isn't there something else you can do about Rockefeller? That we don't know anything about Rockefeller. This is all about Standard Oil. What about the man behind that? And so in 1905, Tarbell published a 2-part sort of continuation of the story, but it was called John D. Rockefeller, A Character Study. This scene, one of the things I didn't get into is that John D. Rockefeller came into oil country with a plan in 1872, and the plan that he executed effectively, created Standard Oil. That it was a deal that he had cut with the railroads, where the producers and the refiners that were allied with this shell company that he created were going to get favorable rates, and everybody else was going to get shut out. And the people in the Pennsylvania oil country either went with Rockefeller or didn't. And the ones who didn't faced some very hard times, and those people included Franklin Tarbell, Ida Tarbell's father. So there was an emotional aspect to this story for Ida Tarbell that was kept out of that 18-part series, but was very evident in that character study. That Ida Tarbell only saw and was only in the company of John D. Rockefeller once. That her research assistant, a man named John Siddall, said, come to Cleveland. I can get us into Rockefeller's church. We can watch him give his Sunday school lesson and watch him during services. And so Ida Tarbell came and studied Rockefeller, stared at him for the duration of that lesson and service, a couple of hours, the way somebody might stare at a painting, looking at every nuance and every detail. And what she came away with was, a most unpleasant picture that she presented. Rockefeller then was suffering from, I think the disease was alopecia, where he had lost all his hair, every hair in his head, eyebrows, eyelashes, and everything. So he really was a freakish-looking person at the moment. And she described him in this. But she ascribed everything Rockefeller did in his life to the worst and ugliest motives. His charity, sure, he gave a lot of money away, but if he was such a devout Christian and Baptist as he claimed, he didn't come close to tithing or giving 10% of his, wealth away in all of this. Mr. Rockefeller's skill in concealing the truth was masterly. His is not a frank nature. There seems to be only one explanation, that Mr. Rockefeller is the victim of a money passion which blinds him to every other consideration of life, which is stronger than his sense of justice, his humanity, his affections, his joy in life, which is the one tyrannous, insatiable force of his being. Money mad, money bad, sane in every way but money mad, was the late Senator Mark Hanna's comment on John D. Rockefeller. No candid study of his career can lead to the conclusion that he is a victim of perhaps the ugliest, the least reasonable of all passions, that for money. Money is an end, a victim for the passion, has mastered all other ambitions and cravings, has made itself supreme, and is in his eyes worthy of what it has cost him. It is not a pleasant picture that such a reflection arouses, not the portrait of a gentleman one would like to know. This money maniac, secretly, patiently, eternally plotting how he may add to his wealth. Nor is the man himself pleasanter to look upon. Study the photograph on page 388, the last taken of Mr. Rockefeller. Study George Varian's powerful sketch from life made in 1903, and say if it be worth the while to be the richest man in the world at the cost these portraits show. Concentration, craftiness, cruelty, and something indefinably repulsive are in them. The photograph reveals nothing more. Mr. Varian's sketch is vastly more interesting, for it suggests, besides both power and pathos, and no one can look long on Mr. Rockefeller without feeling these qualities. And she goes on and on. This was an 18,000 word piece, and much of it sort of had this tone. She talked about Rockefeller taking walks and playing golf, and she said it's probably only so he can live longer so he can make more money. It was very much what you have to call a hit job. But again, it was the Ida Tarbell it was the John D. Rockefeller that Ida Tarbell saw, that Ida Tarbell knew through her reporting, that she talked to, friends of his, but fewer friends than critics of his, including his brother, who hated him. And she crafted this portrait, again, based on her reporting, that she came to it with a point of view, but it was still a point of view that was bolstered by her reporting. You can argue the fairness of the character study, but it was still born of her reporting. The impact was, evident and monumental. The Supreme Court, that a series of court rulings, a series of Justice Department investigations following the series led to a Supreme Court decision that led to the breakup of Standard Oil in 1909. It didn't hurt John D. Rockefeller's pocketbook any, because he owned a piece of all of the companies that Standard Oil was broken up into, and he became even wealthier as a result of Ida Tarbell's journalism. He was loath to criticize Ida Tarbell. That one of the reasons this story was so powerful was that John D. Rockefeller remained mute during most of it. And somebody asked him, "Why don't you respond? Why don't you respond?" And you said, he was taking a walk, and there was a worm crossing the sidewalk. And he said, "You see that worm right there? If I leave that worm alone, it will crawl off into the grass. But if I step on it, it will lie there messy and all the world will see it." And that was his idea about Ida Tarbell, that she was a worm that he was going to let slither on into the grass. But it cost him his reputation. Could he have saved that reputation? Could he have fought back? And I think you can argue that his reputation is, in its entirety, pretty secure. Ron Chernow's book is evidence of that. But you know, that general impression, the answer to that question, John D. Rockefeller is A, a good guy, B, not a good guy. Most of us still jump to B, and it's because of this portrait. Anyway, McClures was pretty much the beginning and the end of early 20th century investigative journalism. That it wasn't very profitable. McClure's magazine fell apart because Samuel McClure had some delusions of grandeur, and his staff left and went to another magazine and continued to do the same kind of investigative work for the better part of a decade, but it sort of died of its own weight. That you know, the interest in investigative reporting was you know, limited, and the profit margin in investigative reporting is and remains limited. And after the death of the magazine Muckraking, investigative journalism sort of took a hiatus. That organized journalism, big journalism, sort of ignored it completely. It was expensive. It did not pay immediate dividends. Not that there weren't isolated, very important stories, but the sort of muckraking, that sort of investigative, and the term muckraking came from Theodore Roosevelt, about digging up dirt. He did not mean it kindly, but the muckrakers embraced it, and investigative reporters have embraced it ever since. That muckraking, that kind of following the document journalism, hearing a story of corruption, following the documents, getting the story from multiple and myriad angles, that was sort of left to independent journalists, two of whom are worthy of mention. George Seldes, who published a little pamphlet called In Fact, in the 1930s and 40s. His you know, one significant story was that no one paid any attention to, were the health hazards of smoking. That he had paperwork, government documents, health studies that showed that tobacco was a carcinogen and smoking cigarettes was a surefire killer 20 years before that mid-60s Surgeon General report came out. But nobody paid any attention because it was just a little 4-page mimeographed pamphlet. I.F. Stone followed George Seldes in the 1950s and 60s with his I.F. Stone's Weekly, which was the same, follow the paper trail, follow the money, follow the paper trail, get the documents, file an FOIA, you know, even before they were, you know, there was a Freedom of Information Act, get the documents that were available, get documents from sources, base your story on documents, on paper. That is a thread that runs through the stories that we know today, the two, you know, colossal journalistic triumphs, the Watergate story of the 1970s, the clergy abuse story of the early years of this decade. Document-based, dispassionate stories that can trace their legacy to Ida Tarbell and the muckrakers. Ida Tarbell was what, when she was through with John D. Rockefeller in 1906, she was 40 years old. She was going to live another 40 years. She continued to write, and she became a wonderfully popular speaker on the Chautauqua circuit. The traveling Chautauquas were not ever affiliated officially with the Chautauqua institution, but they took their inspiration from the institution. They were traveling shows that would have entertainment, would have a political or social issue speaker, would have a literary component, would have an arts component. And Ida Tarbell was a popular speaker who made her living on the Chautauqua circuit for a number of years in the 1920s. But the most fascinating part of Ida Tarbell's post-muckraking experience was her not just reluctance, but refusal to join the suffrage movement or the women's rights movement. That here was a woman who was the quintessential professional woman. She was probably in those decades the most, influential, best known, most accomplished woman in America. certainly the best known in all of this. So naturally, the women's movement came to her and said, you know, won't you get involved? We need your voice. We need you to be involved in this. And she said very politely, thank you, no. That she did not, you know, not only did not take part, she opposed it. She actively opposed it. You know, in a speech in 1911 and in a book in 1912, she echoed a woman in love will never make a good politician. A woman lives for those who depend upon her. That is the difficulty with women in politics. There should be a perfect partnership between men and women. It is a fundamental relation, but it is natural and imperative that a woman should be true to those who belong to them, and that unfits them for statecraft, as it fits them for other important duties of life. The people who built a community out of this landscape, who insisted on schools and churches and a sense of community and family and decency and shoving the joy boat down the river, could not reconcile that essential life duty with that of a professional woman. That one of the people that was in my class last summer was, said, you think she underestimated herself or other women? And I think from this remove, there's no other conclusion that we can make, but that she underestimated the capacity to balance family and profession. But it was her conviction, and it was rooted in these, I don't know for a fact, but you see the seeds of it, the roots of it, in her Pennsylvania girlhood, her oil country girlhood. And it was a conviction deeply held, and one that brought her no shortage of criticism later in her life. That after suffrage finally passed, and women won the right to vote, one of the people who had sparred with Ida Tarbell during this whole period said to Tarbell, "The millennium has begun. You will see the world we will make." And Ida Tarbell's response to that was, "Women will not find themselves in the political field in less than 50 years." To which her jouster said, "You are a bad woman." I think that was very much a minority opinion. That we wrestle with the inconsistency between the accomplished professional woman and the one who pushed equal rights for women away. It's one of the things that make her the fascinating historical legacy that she is. And I am humbled that you have welcomed me into her home to share my thoughts on her. Are there any questions that anybody has? Thank you so very much for... Are there any questions, Greg?
Did she come back here?
Ida
Tarbell, did she come back here?
Yes, she did. She came back here. She taught in the 1930s for 1 year or 1 semester. That they sold the family home in Titusville after her mother died in 1915, 1916. Am I right on those dates? 1918. Okay. She never lived back here. But she did come back to Allegheny from time to time. And her papers are here, that, the rich trove, those of you that are looking for big projects for senior theses and such, there's a woman here who can guide you through, the marvelous resource that Ida Tarbell's papers are. It's also digitized, so you can find it anywhere, you can access it anywhere in the world. But I will say a word here for going through the papers. That, the marvelous thing about a digitized collection is you can find what you're looking for in a second. The problem with a digitized collection is that you can never find what you're not looking for. And in my experience, the joy of going through archives is the discovery of things that you weren't anticipating finding. And so the actual documents are there. You can hold letters that Ida Tarbell typed and signed with her own hand. So, you know, it's a wonderful, wonderful resource for the school to have. And, you know, no more fitting place for it than here. The papers related to John D. Rockefeller are at the Drake Museum in Titusville. That the family split the collection. They felt that you know, the museum should have some, and alma mater should have some as well. So, but Jane is a wonderful guide through these. So, yes.
When it came to her opinion on women not being able to join politics for no less than 50 years, is it because she thought that no other women were like her, but instead of being on the writing track, being on the politics track? Did she just not think that other women had the ability?
No, she did not in any way think that women were, you know, inferior intellectually or unequal, you know, set aside the prejudice that people might have of women in public life. But her own life and career was evidence of her confidence of women's ability to succeed. But she felt that being a wife and mother, being the shepherd of the family, was every bit as important, and the two at that moment were mutually exclusive, and a woman needed to make a choice. And if too many women chose careers, then the fabric of the society would be threatened. That was where she was coming from in that there were only so many women who could choose her path before she felt that society would feel its impact. And her Abraham Lincoln work, you know, she wrestled with you know, what can I say about Abraham Lincoln that hasn't already been said? He was obviously the most written about man in the 19th century. And what she did was find people who knew Abraham Lincoln when he was a young man in Kentucky and Illinois. And, you know, again, a reporter that, you know, the historians were working for government documents. Lincoln, the president, was covered very well. But the person who would become Lincoln the president was still sort of fertile ground, and that was, you know, and that was the Rockefeller book, The History of Standard Oil, did very well. She bought a farm in Connecticut with that money, but the bigger portion of her life's earnings came from Abraham Lincoln. One more? Yes, thank you.
So she didn't marry. So do you know if she had like any fleeting or passing romances that sort of sustained her in that way?
I have found no evidence of that. Jane has been through the papers much more thoroughly than anybody I know. No, there's been, in all of her biographies, there is no suggestion of any serious relationship at any point during her life. Not in college, not when she was in Paris, when she had a very active social life in Paris. But it was sort of group dates that I found nothing, and none of the biographers have found anything to suggest a, you know, deep relationship with anybody. Okay?
Thank you all. Thank you very much.